In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Good morning, St. John's. I've not had a chance to meet or greet you personally yet today, my name is Mariann Budde, honored to serve as the bishop of this diocese, a post that I've held now for 11 years, a job that is primarily one of encouragement, support, resourcing of the 86 congregations in our diocese and the 10 schools. On most Sundays, you'll find me going from church to church, doing what I'm doing today, which is offering a word and spending time with your leaders and celebrating the life that you have. I was going through my files. This is my 4th Sunday visit to St. John's Olney in my time. The second one stands out vividly in my mind because it was Father Henry's 2nd Sunday here, 2016. And my last visit was in late 2019, just a few months before the pandemic that came and changed our lives so dramatically. And it's always a poignant experience for me to read my notes from that time, knowing what I know now, but had no clue of then what was awaiting us all. I'm a great admirer of your rector, Father Henry, and Mother Siobhan, your associate, and now Deacon Nancy, and all the ministry of St. John's. You are one of the stronger Episcopal congregations in the diocese and indeed in northern Montgomery County, and I give thanks to God for you. And for Father Henry, for you especially, with your intentional and thoughtful leadership. Mother Siobhan, your creativity and passion for Christian formation. Deacon Nancy, for your love of service in the name of Christ. And I wonder if you might join me in expressing your gratitude for your... And I always say to a rector that's been on sabbatical, I'm really glad you came back. Last fall, prompted by a conversation with a group of young adults in another congregation that surprised me by wanting to ask far deeper questions of faith that I had anticipated when we first sat down together, I kind of went out on a limb and sent out a notice in my biweekly writings to people across the diocese, and I invited anyone who wanted to send me a question of faith. Couldn't promise that I could answer it definitively, but I'd do my best to respond. There was a slow response at first, but as the days and weeks went on, more questions came to me. And I was and remained really moved by the depth and the vulnerability of those who reached out. And since then, I've used those questions as my springboard for all writings and sermons. So here's the question for today. One person wrote to me, I often wonder if I truly hear God's voice when I ask for his guidance, or if it's my own imagination telling me which way to go. I pray that God will help me to hear his voice and understand his word, but I'm afraid that I get distracted and sometimes I'm overwhelmed and I may not hear him. How do I know? How do I know that I'm going in the direction that God is showing me? It's a great question, particularly for this season in the Christian year. You can see in your bulletin that today is the 3rd Sunday in the season known as Epiphany, a word you may recall that means revelation. To have an epiphany is like the proverbial light bulb going off in your head. And I hear in the question I've just read to you a longing for that, a longing for an epiphany, that moment of clarity with which to set your life course or even to take the next step. And to my way of thinking, an epiphany is anything that comes to us from the outside that resonates deeply with us on the inside. For there's a part of us that's always listening for that connection. It's what the great Black theologian Howard Thurman called the sound of the genuine. The sound of the genuine. In one of his last speeches of his life back in 1980, at commencement for the graduates of Spelman College, he said this: "There's something in each one of you that waits, listens for the sound of the genuine in yourself. And if you cannot hear it, you will never find whatever it is that you are searching for. And if you hear it and do not follow it, it would be better that you had never been born. Because you are the only one, you are the only you," he said, "that has ever lived. You are the only you that has ever lived. Your idiom is the only idiom of its kind in all existence. And if you cannot hear the sound of the genuine in you, you will, all your life, spend your days on the end of strings that somebody else pulls." Quick story about my mom. She's 91, lives nearby here now, but for just recently, she moved here. For years, she lived on her own. And about 5 years ago or so, she was becoming increasingly vulnerable to telemarketers and the kind of people that call on particularly vulnerable older adults, asking them for money, all kinds of scams. And one day, she got a call from a woman who claimed to be her granddaughter, who was stuck in Pennsylvania because her car had broken down, and could her grandmother please send her some money? Now, it turns out my mom has a granddaughter who was in her 30s back then, the daughter of my sister, and she's listening on the phone, really trying to figure out what's happening, what's going on with her granddaughter, and how she can help. Until it dawned on her, she told us later, it dawned on her that if Jennifer, her granddaughter, was calling her, she really ought to be calling her mother, Christine. And she hung up the phone, right? Because it lacked the sound of the genuine voice of her granddaughter. We just heard one version read, Deacon Nancy just read one of the several versions of the story of how Jesus called his first disciples to follow him, those 4 first fishermen. There's several versions of the same story in the gospel accounts, but what they all have in common is their description of how clear those 4 fishermen were when they heard the voice of Jesus, that they needed to drop everything and follow him. And this particular version always reminds me of that moment in the musical West Side Story, which I've seen 30 times, in which Tony and Maria first see each other across the crowded high school gymnasium dance, right? And immediately they knew that they were meant for each other. Apparently that's how some people fall in love. And that's how some of Jesus' followers decided that they knew in an instant. There must have been something so genuine about Jesus, and what they heard him say must have gone straight to their heart. They must have heard what they were searching for, as Thurman would say, and they were ready to say yes. Now, I wish I could tell the person who asked me the question about how to hear God speaking and to guide his or her steps, that they would just know the way the disciples of Jesus seemed to know. But if I'm honest, I have to say that for those of us who want to follow God now, to hear the voice of Jesus now, for those of us who really want to hear and respond to the sound of that genuine call, there's actually no escaping the need for us to cultivate some inner practices that help us first to listen for whatever God might be saying, and then equally important, this is really important, to ponder and reflect upon what we think we're hearing, to test our perceptions, and over time, to get ready for we sense what's being asked of us. Because sometimes what looks like an impulsive decision on our part for someone who's watching is really something that's been taking shape in us for some time. In fact, in my imagination, I suspect that before they dropped everything to follow Jesus, the disciples had been around him in other ways. I mean, the villages of Galilee were pretty small. And I suspect they had been in each other's company. The text says that Jesus started his public ministry with the news that John the Baptist had been arrested. That was a big deal. He was part of John's movement. Maybe the others who would become followers of Jesus were too. Maybe John's arrest had that same kind of galvanizing effect. You know what I'm saying? I just think that there was something in the air, and there was something about Jesus, so that when he made the call, they were ready. Now, one may call this practice that I've been describing of inner listening and pondering, you might just call it prayer. But if so, it's a particular kind of prayer that has a specific purpose. It's to get an answer to the question, right? It's discerning prayer, the process we must go through to decide what to do in response to an invitation or a circumstance. And one of the people whose definition of this process, Urban Holmes, describes it this way. And I'm going to go through this slowly, what he said, because it's taken me a while to fully grasp. But this is what he said. Discernment, this kind of process I'm talking about, is our ability to intuit deep down God's will by casting a particular question that the Christian faces in a given situation, right? So this is very specific. A particular question in a given situation before the judgment of the deeper self, right? Way down deep. And the result of that discernment will be a willingness to risk decisions and to take actions whose outcome is enigmatic at best. In other words, once you've come to that place of clarity, you're willing to take risks. You're even willing to be wrong because it's so deep inside you. You're willing to fail at whatever it is that you sense you're being called to do because, as one person, Marian Wright Edelman, famously said, it's better to fail at the things that matter than to succeed in the things that don't, right? Right? So you're willing to go out on the limb because you have reached that kind of clarity. So my question to you, to myself, is how do we go about doing that? That kind of discerning prayer. What is it that we're doing exactly when we're pondering? I always think of Winnie the Pooh in that with my think, you know, think. And for some of us, the work is really quiet and internal, you know, that some regular practice of just simply sitting and sifting through our thoughts. If you're lucky to have a life that allows you to sit quietly and sift through your thoughts. For others, pondering requires some kind of movement. These are the people that go for a run and to gain clarity, or take a walk in nature. Apparently, the former President Obama, he would go out and shoot baskets, and he would kind of work things out on the court. My favorite presidential example is that of FDR. It said that when he had a momentous decision to make, he would pretend that he got sick and go to bed. Love that. I'm the kind of person, and my husband can tell you this, I'm the kind of person that putters, T-T-E-R-S, putters as I ponder. Doesn't really matter what I do. I often clean the house or sort a closet or rake leaves. But I just need to be moving and quiet at the same time. which kind of allows my brain to sift through things, you know? Talking to other people can be really helpful, especially if it's somebody that you trust, knows, and you know has your best interest at heart, not someone with an agenda for you, right? But again, it all comes down to your inner life and what the deeper self is encouraging you to do. So I'm going to leave you with just one practice and a final story, okay? And here's the practice, which I first came across in a little book that's entitled Sleeping with Bread. And the title comes from a story about when children were left orphaned and starving after the Second World War. And when they were at last given food in the refugee camps, they couldn't trust that there would be another meal. And so they would eat themselves sick every time. And so the caregiver's solution was to allow the children to go to sleep holding a loaf of bread so that they knew that they could wake up confident that there would be food for them in the morning. And inspired by this image of children holding their loaves of bread, the authors of this book describe a practice of holding on to the things that give us life as we're moving through times of uncertainty and decision-making. And the practice is simply this: at the end of every day, simply to take a few moments and ask yourself two questions. What happened today for which that I'm most grateful for? What's the thing that I will give thanks for as I lay my head down tonight? And what's the thing I'm not so grateful for? Or you can ask the question a million different ways. What made me feel alive today? Where did I feel life draining out of me? And it's not something that one day's data point is all that helpful for us, because everybody can have a day, right? But over time, the practice is helpful. So if you set yourself a period of time when you just chart, what gives me life? What gives me joy? Where do I find energy? What sucks energy out of me? That might be a clue as to where God would be pleased for your life to go. Howard Thurman said, again, in another speech, don't ask yourself what the world needs. Ask what makes you come most alive, because what the world most needs are people who are alive with a sense of joy and purpose and excitement for the lives that they're living. So, now here's the story. Example of this. Years ago, I met an Episcopal priest who was serving as the director of a camp in a retreat center. I had gone to the retreat center because I was with my young family. We were making a transition. I was about to become the rector of a church in another state. And as I realized when we were talking that he was also planning to leave his position as a camp director to go to work for a residential program for troubled teenagers. It's kind of a surprise to me. And when we talked more about it, he said something I've never forgotten. He said, I've been preparing all of my life for this job. He struck me as kind of old at the time. He was probably in his 50s. And, and I looked like a long way off from where I stood. I'm 63 now. But I had this sense at the time that he was telling me a lot about his life in just that one sentence. Maybe about his childhood and his own acquaintance with trouble. No doubt about some failures along the way, some vocational uncertainty. He also was telling me about his gifts and his passions, and that he felt ready and called at this particular moment to a place where he could exercise those gifts most fully. Now, this clearly wasn't like a step up the vocational ladder in the Episcopal priesthood, let me tell you. It's a real step down. But for him, what was his whole life was preparing him to do. He heard the call and he was ready. And as I said, he was several decades ahead of me in life and ministry, and I remember envying him and saying to myself, I want to be able to say that someday. Oh, what I would give to be able to say that someday. And I also knew I couldn't leapfrog over 30 years of life to do that. that it would be one step at a time if God were to bless me with that kind of clarity. And most days, I'd be stumbling along in the dark, putting one foot in front of another. So let me just leave you with a word of encouragement. Should any of you be in an area of your life that needs this kind of discerning and listening and waiting for the sound of the genuine, simply to trust your own unique ways of listening and pondering, whatever it is that helps you make the connection between what you're hearing from the outside and what resonates deep within you. If it's a really big decision you're wrestling with, it's always good to take some time and to seek out the wisdom people in your life whom you can trust. And should you be that person for another, you and I both know that that is very holy ground. And simply know that though you don't see me very often, I'm praying for you as you listen for his voice and the sound of the genuine in your own heart, and that you be given sufficient clarity and courage to respond. And I pray the same for all of you as a community, under the good leadership of your clergy and vestry, as you collectively do the same. God bless you. Amen.